Welcome to episode 7. I can't believe we're already at 7 out of a 9-part series. But hey, coming up today, you are going to hear a fabulous interview. This is from Peter Tsukahira.
You know, I wasn't sure exactly what to expect when we were climbing Mount Carmel to get to interview Peter Tsukahira. He's a Japanese American that was called many years ago to move to Israel with his wife, and the work that he's doing there is extraordinary. So this interview is heavy on the inspiration side, but there are some things about this interview that really connected me personally with some of his past experiences prior to his walking in faith. So you're going to find aspects of Peter's story that I think you'll bond to, or they'll remind you of somebody that you know. And when you see what it's emerged or what's evolved to, it's very inspirational. So I'm really looking forward to sharing this particular interview with you. Peter, thank you so much for taking some time today. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Well, Patrick, I'm a Japanese American Israeli. I have a Japanese-looking face, an American-sounding voice, and an Israeli passport.
Wow.
And my wife and I came here as immigrants 30 years ago. In fact, 30 years ago this year.
Wow.
And we're both American-born. She's from a Jewish-American family. I'm from a Japanese-American family. We came to the Lord out of the hippie counterculture of the 1960s and the 1970s. We met in Boston, university there. But as soon as God got a hold of us, he began to speak to us about his plans for our life. And he told us we should get married and we would go into ministry and that we'd end up in Israel.
Huh.
And back then, neither of us had ever been here. We didn't know that much more about Israel than what we'd read, but we knew 40 years ago that we would end up here.
Wow.
And so we prepared for the ministry in the U.S., ministered there and in Japan for a while. But in 1987, God opened the doors for us to come to this land. And it was an experience like we had never experienced before, and nothing that we could have really even adequately prepared for. You know, to come as immigrants, it's the big reset button. You really start your life all over again. And we went through the culture shock and the language shock, but we knew that we would land here in this city, the city of Haifa, and that we would be planted on this mountain, which is Mount Carmel. And of course, it's biblically, it's the mountain of Elijah the prophet, and where he confronted the false prophets of Baal, rebuilt the altar of the Lord, prayed the prayer of faith, and God answered with fire that changed the nation of Israel back in the days of Elijah, changed the whole nation for more than a generation. So we have felt for a long time that that was our mandate, to once again bring the sacrifice that pleases God, rebuild his altar, pray the prayer of faith, and that God would answer by the fire of his presence to turn the hearts of the people of modern Israel, Jews and Arabs, back to the living God.
Well, you've landed at a beautiful spot here. We're outside on top of Mount Carmel. As a matter of fact, you just said just over my shoulder over here is the very top of Mount Carmel, right? It's the highest point of Mount Carmel. And there's a lot of significance, as you alluded to, biblically in this area. So did you seek this out when you first came here, or how did you end up here?
Yes, we knew that this was the place that God had selected for us. And but when we got here, it was really an experience of discovery. Well, first of all, Mount Carmel is not a mountain in the traditional sense. It's really a ridge, and about 20-some miles long. The western edge sticks out into the Mediterranean, and the southeastern end overlooks the Valley of Armageddon. So it's a ridge maybe 500-some meters above sea level at its highest point, and this is the highest point. Yeah. We're right in the middle of it, right here, where our worship center and our ministry center are located. Behind me is our worship center, the worship center of the Carmel congregation, built here on Mount Carmel, and it's the first building built in modern times by an indigenous Israeli Messianic congregation for the purpose of worshiping Jesus in his own land, among his own people, in his own language. This is the first building built for that purpose in modern times.
So what was it like coming to this country and bringing a Christian message here? And what has evolved over time? Have you seen any changes since you've been here?
Well, first of all, when we arrived here, it was a lot different than it is today. I would say 30 years ago, there were less than 200 believers in our entire city.
Wow.
This is the third largest city of Israel, about 200,000 or 300,000 people. Less than 200 believers. That meant that within a year, we basically knew the names of just about everybody. And there were two small fellowships that were already in operation. Now, we wouldn't call them Christians because they were mostly Jews. And so we called them Messianic Jews. They prefer to maintain their identity as Jewish people, although they fully believe that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, the King of Kings, and the Lord of Lords. They're disciples of Jesus, but they identify with the original apostles before Christianity even became a movement.
Right.
And so that was, first of all, that was a discovery that we had to make, that believers here call themselves Messianic believers. They call their communities congregations and not churches. And there's a new expression of faith in Jesus, biblical faith in Jesus, but it's arising from the people of Israel, the same people that Jesus knew, but many years ago. So he's being worshipped in his own land, in his own language, by his own people for the first time in 2,000 years.
Wow.
And so even though the numbers were small, we realized from day one, this was remarkable. This wasn't something that could have been taught us in Bible school. It wasn't something that they could have, that they had textbooks about in seminary.
Right.
We had to come and actually meet these people ourselves and learn how they were solving problems, what it meant for Israeli Jews and Christian Arabs alongside of them, in many cases, to worship Jesus in his own land and in his own language for the first time again. So it was a great discovery process.
Wow, and this is what I'm curious about, if you can remember when you first got here, because it's been some decades now.
Yeah.
But Israel and the land of the Bible, if you will, lived abstractly in your mind when you were training, right?
Right.
What was the difference between understanding it from your classroom training and reading versus putting your feet on the ground here and being here? Was there a different experience relative to that for you?
That's a really good question, Patrick. It was like really coming to ground. And it was a process of having those abstractions stripped away.
Yeah.
And realizing when it says Nazareth, it means Nazareth. When it says Mount Carmel, you don't have to translate that into, this Carmel, that Carmel, our city, this continent, our nation. Okay, it meant here.
Right.
So it was that process of really entering a more substantial biblical reality, and also realizing that there were tremendous challenges and spiritual enemies that had to be overcome in order to bring the faith that was originally released by these people to the world, to bring it back to them 2,000 years later.
Right.
And so it really was a period of spiritual and cultural shock that we went through as new immigrants 30 years ago.
What was the most shocking thing?
Well, first of all, it was the language.
Yes.
I studied Japanese, I spoke English, and now Hebrew has no relationship to either of those languages. It was completely starting afresh. And then to learn that it's a reborn language. People didn't speak it as an everyday language for over 1,000 years.
Right.
And it was basically recreated for the purpose of use in the modern nation. And to struggle with learning a new language. And then after we'd been here 2 or 3 years, of course, we had our first war experience. And in 1991, the first Gulf War took place. And if you remember, Saddam Hussein, who was ruling Iraq at the time, had taken over Kuwait. And the first President Bush had given him a countdown, a deadline. You get out of Kuwait by this date or there's going to be war. And so the whole world was counting down. Yeah. And what Saddam Hussein said in the Arabic press, which was, of course, immediately translated into the Israeli press, was that if any Western power attacks me, I will immediately attack Israel. I mean, that may not sound logical, but in this part of the world, that's how it works. Okay, I'll immediately attack Israel. And he was boasting that he would burn half of Israel with weapons of mass destruction. So in the countdown to the war, we were following our government's instructions to get gas masks. We had 2 small children at the time.
Wow.
We had to seal a room in our apartment, and they gave instructions how to put tape and on the windows and seal the doors. Our son was too small to have a gas mask issued to him, so what they issued him was a small plastic pup tent that you had to thrust the little baby inside, zip it up, and then you could kind of feed him a bottle with the gloves, that they handed
Oh,
him.
wow.
And the fear was that Saddam Hussein would carry out his promise and attack Israel with nerve gas.
It's a very strange characterization to hear the words, our first war.
Yeah.
And I can remember watching the news back in the States, with the first Gulf War and the countdown and everything. But boy, being here and coming from, a place like the United States to this hotbed, right? Which biblically over time, it's just always been that way, right? And here you are, having to, get tents for your little child and have a whole preparation done, and it became a new way of life. So I guess that's culture shock, huh?
Well, everybody who becomes a citizen of Israel has to have a first war, it seems.
Yeah.
And this was ours. And as new immigrants we were just barely being able to understand the television and the radio, when to go in the room, when to come out of the room, when to put on the gas mask or not. It was a dislocating and frightening experience. But we also saw the hand of God miraculously protect the nation.
Yeah.
I think what was said after that, 39 big Scud missiles fell in this country, 9 of them in our city of Haifa. And these were not the little rockets that are shot by Hamas in the south or Hezbollah from Lebanon. Those rockets, they fire by the dozens from the back of trucks.
Right.
And they're dangerous because they're anti-personnel terror weapons. They're loaded with ball bearings, and if you're in the open, they can seriously wound you or even kill you. But these Scud missiles they had like 500 pounds of explosives in them. They would take out entire buildings. But I think it was about 100 days of war, only one person was actually killed as a direct result of those missiles, which is a miracle.
Yeah.
In fact, there are some people who say that during that first Gulf War, the death rate in Israel actually went down. Fewer people than normal actually died, and if that's true, it's because Israelis didn't drive as much.
Interesting.
They only launched the missiles at night, and so you knew when it was like 4 or 5 in the afternoon here, it was already 6 or 7 in Iraq, and so people stayed off the roads.
Right. What's very interesting is many of the people I've met here since we've been in Israel have this sense of God's protection.
Yeah.
For the state of Israel.
Yeah.
And they don't have it just abstractly, but they like to cite specific instances where things that would defy normal logic occur that seem to just protect this place.
Absolutely. Not only have we heard those stories, but we've experienced it ourselves. And when we came through that war experience, I think something changed in us.
Yeah.
After the first Gulf War, we felt like we'd somehow turned some kind of spiritual corner, and that our roots, after 3 years, were finally beginning to go down into the rocky soil of this land, and that we began to feel like we were Israelis.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that just in the months after the end of the first Gulf War, in the spring of 1991, God put us together with another couple. They were pioneering a drug and alcohol rehabilitation center in another part of Haifa. A small Bible study had started there. We came alongside of them and began to pray together, and God spoke to us that spring, start a new congregation. And that's how this ministry was born, about 26 years ago in 1991.
Wow. So leading up to all the anxiety before your first war, as you described it, did that have any impact on your faith? Or were you starting to question whether you really did the right thing?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So tell me what that was like.
Being an immigrant was one of the hardest things I ever did. Nothing can prepare you for that. You really start your life again. And in our case, we didn't really have family here. We didn't have friends. We didn't have connections. We didn't know the language. We didn't understand the culture. We didn't know how to get things done in the society, in our neighborhood. Within a year or two, our children were speaking more Hebrew than we were.
Yeah.
After a while, the years pass and you're begging your children to read the electricity bill to you, and you can't help them with their homework.
Right.
And if something happens in their school, you can't walk in and help them sort it out.
Right.
There's this huge feeling of helplessness, and people look at you and wonder, how long are you going to stick around here, because they've seen so many people come and get discouraged and go. There wasn't that sense of commitment and permanence in the relationships, and so it was really difficult. And now I realize that's the experience of all refugees and all immigrants.
Right.
And I have a great compassion for people who are forced to leave their homes and start afresh somewhere else. In fact, years later, we were privileged to be able to start a shelter here for refugees and reach out to strangers who have walked across the borders of Israel. And so we've been able to share out of compassion what we learned in those early days of difficulty as new immigrants here.
What is that like when you see, there's obviously a lot of tragedy going on, not that far from where we're sitting right now. A lot of displaced people who are victims of horrible circumstances, and they literally, as you said, walk across the border. So what's it like to take them in and to try to give them some sense of hope in their life?
Well, what we've learned is that this nation, Israel, it really, biblically and prophetically, it's the center of the world. This is where the worlds are in collision.
Yeah.
And our entire region is in a massive and historical era of change. All the old colonial borders are being erased, different people groups. It's really what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24. He said, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There'll be wars and famines in various places. These are the beginning of birth pangs. We feel those birth pangs. We have a contraction, a crisis, and then a period of calm. But we know we're just getting ready for another contraction, another crisis is coming. And so all around us in Africa and the Middle East, people are being forced from their homes by the hundreds of thousands, and in the case of Syria, by the millions. And some have, the ones from Africa, actually escaped genocide in Darfur out of Sudan in the early years, before the creation of South Sudan. Of course, that is now descended into civil war. They walked up the Nile into Egypt and then met tragedy and mistreatment, abuse in Egypt. And so some of them, this was 12 or 13 or 14 years ago, were paying Bedouin guides to take them into the Sinai and point them in the direction of the Israeli border, and they were walking into Israel.
Wow.
And so we started a shelter for the women and the children, many of them widows, and some of the children who were orphaned, really to obey the biblical command to care for the stranger.
Right.
And these people were really strangers like us. They had no language skills. They didn't know how to. They couldn't work. They had no legal status. They had no advocacy for them in the government. And so we began taking care of some of them. We really believe that the Bible teaches that our faith without works is not useful.
Yeah.
And that if we really believe the right things, we're going to do the right things. And particularly, the Lord commands us to reach out to the widows and to the orphans, to the helpless and to the needy. So this is part of our ministry expression of our faith, and that is to reach out to the stranger, to the refugee, to those women who are seeking asylum. They don't have their husbands are lost. Some are back in Eritrea. Their families have been torn apart. Some of these women have been trafficked on their way across the Sinai, and they come to us in pretty rough shape, some of them. So we're taking care of a number of women and an even larger number of children. Over 100 children have been actually born over the years to women who've been seeking shelter here. They know that they're going to get better treatment in Israel. And so we try to be a part of that, God's compassion. And here we have this activity called Africa's Heart, where they make handbags, and it's really to give them an activity, so that they can do something that's useful, give them a sense of purpose and dignity, and sell these bags, and all the profits, all the proceeds, of course, go directly to the women.
That's wonderful work. So it's interesting from your own personal experience in following a calling when you came here all those years ago. Would you have envisioned that you'd have this kind of shelter being taking care of these types of refugees? I mean,
when this happened to us, our congregation was already maturing. Okay,
Right.
Our congregation was already 15 years old, and we were growing, and we knew we were more confident of our call to reach the Jews and the Arabs of Israel, and to build and to plant congregations, to teach, and to raise up a Messianic remnant that hadn't been around for 2,000 years. I mean, that was consuming us. So the idea of now caring for African refugees who were really out of our scope was, we struggled with it.
Yeah.
We struggled with it, and until the Lord finally had to show us this was the call of the chosen people, was to care for the stranger.
Yeah.
And something that I think touches the heart of God. And certainly we learned so many things by the process of learning to accept them and really to make them part of this community.
So this is interesting then about the inspiration, because as I'm looking at how you've answered a calling to come here in the first place, so something when you came to faith inspired inside of you to say, okay, we're going to do things, we're going to do radical things based on this. But then I think would you describe, and I'd like to understand how you experience it, that what that was, and if that was more kind of an internal thing, and then is it inspiration from the external work, like working with these refugees?
Right.
Is that a similar type of inspiration, different? How do you experience it?
It's both biblical and experiential.
Mm-hmm.
I think what originally lit the fuse of our passion to come to Israel and to become a part of this nation was the biblical understanding that it was the people of Israel who gave us this one book that tells us about God. And it's written by Israeli Jews, and it was preserved by Israeli Jews, and then the apostles and Jesus himself were Israeli Jews. And now there is an Israel, again, a nation alive from the dead after nearly 2,000 years. I guess we thought as new believers, why wouldn't you go, right? why wouldn't you go if you had the chance? And so when we came, I mean, Israel was less than 40 years old as a modern nation.
Yeah.
And we saw an opportunity, and we really felt God was drawing us into this, to become a part of this nation and participate in not only building up the nation, but reestablishing a messianic witness, like there was back in the days of the book of Acts, and actually before the days of the book of Acts.
Right.
Okay, when it was Jesus and his disciples walking and serving and ministering right in this part of the country. So that was an amazing excitement. And then when we got here, in spite of the difficulties, as we began to meet those and overcome those challenges, what we realized is this nation is so rich not only in history and archaeology, but it's almost as if spiritually it's a place where God has hidden secrets. Mm-hmm. Knowing that we would come, right, 2,000 years later, right, and rediscover these things. Even just the geography. If you love the Bible, mm-hmm, the geography tells you about the Bible.
Yes.
They went from here to here, and now we know how long it took them. Okay, for example, that Cana, where Jesus performed his first miracle, in a car, it's less than 5 minutes drive from Nazareth. So
Right.
So how long did it take them to walk? Well, probably about half an hour. So that means they knew everybody there, right? And maybe that explains why Mary, Jesus' mother, has so much authority there. It's probably relatives of Jesus, and she's been asked to kind of MC the wedding. So these things become more obvious from just knowing how the land is laid out, and why they mention this city and that city, and why they walked from here to there, and when he's in Lebanon meeting with the Syrophoenician woman, they didn't get there by accident. You don't get there by accident,
Right.
Not on foot.
Right.
You walk several days. So
Right.
he was there on purpose. And Caesarea Philippi is the same thing, up near the Lebanese border. So much we began to learn, and then of course when you go to Jerusalem, it's just layer upon layer of secrets, and the archaeologists, of course, are digging down historically. But biblically, things are being revealed, and I think really it's a sign that we've entered the final chapter, really the end times, and God is preparing ourselves and Christians everywhere for the last part of this great story.
You know, it seems that the story of the Bible is so much a story of this land, and you know, like there's people and you know and characters in it, but the land somehow comes to life, and it's very different being here and walking it.
Absolutely. This is where our roots are. You know, the name Israel is mentioned in the Bible more than any other name. I think it's more than 2,300 times.
Wow.
More than Jesus, more than God, more than any other thing. Israel, and of course, the land is the land of Israel.
Yeah.
And so it's really is our roots, not just the roots of the Jewish people, not just the roots of the Arab people, but every Christian, we receive that spirit of adoption, whereby we call the God of Israel Abba, Father.
Okay.
And we know from the writings of Paul that by faith we have become the children of Abraham.
Right.
And of course, the prophecy of Malachi is to turn the hearts of the children back to the fathers. I tell people the fathers aren't Martin Luther and John Calvin or Billy Graham.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? The fathers are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Right.
And when we Christians begin to really get that sense, the Bible becomes many times richer than if we're only understanding and focusing on the New Testament.
For someone who doesn't have faith, how would you describe what the experience is or what the inspiration feels like experientially, and maybe even existentially?
Well, maybe I should start with my own story in brief. You know, I was not raised in a believing family. We went to church, but I came to the conclusion when I was like 13 that not only did I not believe, no one in the church really believed.
Right.
We were just all going through the motions.
Right.
So I didn't go back into a church really for 10 years. But what brought me back was the death of my best friend, who was my roommate in our university in the Boston area. And he killed himself, and I had tried my best to convince him not to do it. I mean, he'd shared his feelings with me, he'd shared his plans with me, we had talked for weeks about it. And so when there was even an incident where he was from Denver. I'd gone out to his home and he'd bought a handgun, and I was 22 years old. I'd never done anything in my life, but I wanted to save him. I didn't know what to do. One afternoon, we were out in the fields out towards Kansas, all alone, and I took the gun from him, and these crazy thoughts are racing through my mind. I thought, well, what should I do? I have to do something. Maybe I should shoot myself. If I shot myself, maybe I could save him. And then I thought, no, that might not work, And then I had a terrible thought right after that, and it was this: that even if I knew that by taking my own life I would save him, I still wouldn't do it, because the bottom line was that to me my life was more precious than his. So later, when I met real born again people, they challenged me. They said, well, Jesus died for you. And a year earlier I would have said, why did I ask him to do that? What a waste. But after I'd had that experience with my friend and lost my friend, I suddenly I wanted to know. I said, wait a minute, are you telling me that this Jesus, he thinks my life is more important than his? He's the kind of person that he would make a decision that he would give up his life just so that I could live? And they went, yeah. Exactly. But they didn't know what I'd been through, and so that's why I said to them, well, tell me more about him. And that really started this search and this biblically and coming to faith and realizing that it's not just a biblical story, but it's he's alive by his Spirit. That's the testimony of these men who wrote the Bible.
Right.
That he's not dead. He rose from the grave, and his Spirit is alive. Now, as a 20-some-year-old young person and as a teenager, I had drug experiences. I'd been on hallucinogens and other drugs, and I'd had spiritual experiences. I knew there was a spirit world, but I'd never met the Spirit of God. And these first Christians in the United States, they told me God is a spirit, and you need to worship him in spirit and in truth. I said, how do you do that? They said, pray. I said, what's prayer? They said, talk to God. I said, that's it. No book. No, I don't recite something. I don't have to sign anything. I don't have to join anything. They said, no, it's just you and God. You talk to him, and when you really mean it, he's going to send his spirit will come to you. So I said, okay, so what's this spirit like? I mean, I'd had very spooky, dark spiritual experiences up until then. They said the Spirit of God is just like Jesus. And I said, well, I know something about Jesus. He's a good man. He didn't advocate violence. Okay, I could meet that spirit. So I would just walk out into the desert. This was in New Mexico. I'd walk out into the desert and talk to God. And maybe it felt strange, but about the third or fourth day, I really felt there was a presence there. And there was something from the very start. I connected this. This is the God of Israel. This is the God of the Jewish people. And so when a personal relationship was established and I'd gone through the basics of repentance and forgiveness and what is the Bible and who is God and what is he like and how to approach him, there was just this fire was lit. I've got to find out about Israel. Because somehow Israel, to me, was from the start was the evidence.
Right.
You know, if this story is more than a good story, okay, if this story is more than just religion, then the evidence will be in Israel. So I knew from the start we'd at least have to come. I didn't know in the very beginning that we would end up living our lives here.
Wow. So, you made a distinction which is interesting that I'd love to hear your thoughts on, because you said, you're experiencing some form of spirituality, as you were experimenting with, hallucinogens, what have you. But that's different than what it means to have your faith now and what that experience is. Can you make the distinction?
Well, the distinction is what spirit you end up in contact with. And, I was doing all kinds of things and looking for spiritual reality in peyote and mescaline and Native American religions, and I was having experiences. I knew there was stuff out there, but for me personally, most of it was frightening, and dark, and even demonic. I mean, even then, without knowing the Bible, I knew that some of it was just demonic, was evil.
Yes.
And so I was getting to the point where I didn't want to have those experiences anymore. And that was when I met the Christians. They said, well, you need to meet the Spirit of God. And that's why I asked them, so what is your God's Spirit like? Okay, because I'm not sure if I want to meet just any spirit. And I think that's the differentiation. I mean, God is alive, but there are other gods.
Right.
The world is ask the Hindus. They know there's millions of gods. My ancestors from Japan. Okay, there's a God for every neighborhood. There's a God in every shrine. Okay, there's lots of gods out there, and native people in just about every culture on the planet know that's true.
Right.
But this book tells about this God, and it's more than just a spiritual experience. It was when that spiritual experience came into focus and aligned with facts. Facts, history, land, people. It just kind of got a lock on me, and I realized I had to pursue this and find out more, and that's one of the things that led us here.
What's interesting is that, and I think that's a big part of the point, this isn't just some kind of a whimsical, mystical experience,
Right.
With a spirit.
Right.
There's a lot of history and a lot of things that have unfolded that are at this point well documented. And through this process with Christ Revealed, having interviewed many of these biblical archaeologists and the people in the apologetics community, and looking at how it all comes together. I mean, there's a deep amount or comprehensive sphere of history and evidence that continues to unfold to support it. So now you're here living in it, and more and more comes out. In your work that you do here, what have you seen as far as inspiration in people that come to your congregation here?
Well, the amazing thing is that we're seeing more and more Israeli Jews open their hearts to Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah. And it's really an amazing thing. The older generation really has deep, deep wounds from the Holocaust. When we first arrived here 30 years ago, it was not uncommon. You'd see elderly people on the bus holding onto the strap, and you'd notice that on their arm and there was the concentration camp tattoos.
Yeah.
And we met Holocaust survivors. We shared our faith with some of them, and what we found is that many of them came back as survivors from that systematic mass murder, that genocide, shaking their fist at God. Some of them saying to God, "I'll never believe in you again. How could you have allowed this to happen to our people?" And we saw this brokenness, and it wasn't just hostility to the name of Jesus. It was just a brokenness, an inability to even deal with the concept of God again. But now the younger Israelis, the ones who've been born and raised in this land and are growing up now, it's a really different attitude. The land, in a sense, is healing them. And now there's a growing interest in this. Who is this Yeshua? Who is this Jesus, this Israeli Jew who changed the world? I know, even among non-believing Jews, there's the beginning of this sense. Whether we believe in him or not, that's another thing.
Right.
But let's be honest, this is the guy who did more to change the world than Sigmund Freud or Karl Marx or Albert Einstein or even Steven Spielberg. Okay, this guy, he's a giant. Okay, so there's even some non-believing Israeli Jews, which is new in this country, that are beginning to say, so why, if we need to know about him, if we want to know about him, why do we have to go to the foreigners? Okay?
Right.
How come our people aren't teaching us everything we need to know about this Israeli Jew who changed the world? So there's a generational change taking place, and I think that's the most remarkable thing. The Jesus of history is really becoming the living Jesus for people like myself, but also now for members of a new generation of Israelis.
So in summing all this up, is there any words of inspiration that you might have for people who are watching this right now?
I would say, for Christians everywhere, we should all realize we're the first Christians in 2,000 years who can come to a nation called Israel, the homeland of the Jewish people. And not only that, the first Christians in 2,000 years, that once we come to this land, we can find our way into a house of worship where Jesus is being worshipped by his own people, in his own land, in his own language for the first time in 2,000 years. The last time this happened, they wrote about it in the book of Acts.
Right.
Now you can get off a plane, and like you've done, you can come in and see it with your own eyes. It's something you can touch with your own hands. And first of all Christians should go, wow, I'm part of a chosen generation. This is an amazing fact. But then I believe we need to open our hearts and allow the implications of that fact, of that truth to sink in. It means that God is in the business, okay, of changing the world and finishing what he started and keeping all of his promises. And it should lead us back into the Bible with renewed interest. And I would also say that all Christians somehow, they need to come here.
Yeah.
Find a way to come to Israel, see this place, and learn what God is doing here.
Well, I've only been here for a few days, and I can't help but agree with you.
Okay, that's good.
So much so. It's been an amazing experience, and thank you so much for bringing all this to life here. It was an amazing representation and conversation, so thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Patrick. It's my pleasure.